Hello everyone, and welcome back to another history lecture. I've noticed I've fallen into this pattern of apologizing at the beginning of every single video for the very unpredictable and random spurts of timelines on which my videos are uploaded. But again, I am very sorry. This past semester has been incredibly busy for me as a student who is also working. And I think what's also been taking a lot more of my time is I actually was just having this conversation with my roommate. The way I usually find inspiration or I want to feel moved by things is by reading, and reading as much as I can. And I think she is someone who is very much involved in experience and the richness of being able to learn and adapt to experience and thus educating yourself through it. And that's something I feel like I've always really lacked the initiative to do, because I always think as long as I have my books, I can learn, I can read, and I can expose myself to the world just through reading these books. But I think at this point in my life as a young adult, I have really noticed the incredible importance of balancing the two. Yes, I think informing yourself through theory and literature and other people's thinking is very critical, but so is experience. So I think in the past month I have been putting myself through the idea of experience more, instead of just holding up in my room and reading books and thinking I'm exposing myself to the world in this way. It's no longer just me just bringing up some random artist that I think is interesting or just regurgitating this book that I read. I definitely feel now more of this necessity and this urge to discuss it in relation to critical and current events. Because I think for me, what art means is it's something that produces catharsis. And, catharsis being subjective to whoever is feeling this moment. But now when I read about art and I'm consuming media or literature theory about it, I feel like genuine catharsis. I feel the art as if it is in the now. And I think as I regard that shift when I'm researching and I'm kind of formulating these videos, I really have to kind of meet this new level of intention, requirement of care of what I'm thinking about. And I have to be very conscious and intentful, not only in my research, but I think also how I myself am digesting the news and media around me. And this first book I'm bringing up, actually, I read before this, but inspired me to kind of reread through a recent conversation I had with these two artists, Lisa Wynn and Wei. And they were actually having this exhibition in San Francisco, so I got the opportunity to talk to them. And I think we mainly spoke about what is so unique about their practice, in the sense that they collaborate so closely together as a partnership. And this idea of holding shared agency within your work, I think was really interesting to me. But I'm gonna put it up. You should definitely go check out their work if you're interested. But essentially this book by Sydney Sitterheim, Artist Audience Accomplice. I think I've mentioned another one of her books before in a previous video. I think it was Wages Against Artwork. And she talks about this idea of being the accomplice or the assistant in a very interesting, decentered way. Kind of looking at it opposed to this traditional binary of just seeing whether you're the artist or the audience, but that there is this weird external third of being an assistant or accomplice. That's kind of the overarching thesis of the book, but I am going to be talking about one very specific chapter, the first one, and it is regarding Chris Burden's work. I think what I find interesting in the base of such work, in the base of performance work, in the sense that it elicits this reaction, this larger idea that you can use your own physicality as the work's principal medium. And I think what the power of performance is that its ability to refuse a structure, to discuss its own representation, and it really can't be boxed into a regurgitation of critical theory that you can box into phrases or lingua franca of academia. It is the people who are participating in it as the central artistic medium and material. But before I start, of course, I do have to show everyone what tea I am drinking. So I am drinking a cardamom black tea today, but something very Korean I've been doing recently is putting walnuts and these dried persimmons in my tea, because my mom does it and it just makes it taste thicker, and I really like it. And something else I've been really enjoying adding in my teas is this loose leaf chrysanthemum from the Chi, and they have really, really amazing and great herbal teas and blends that I really recommend. I wanted to start with this quote from Burden. I think a lot of my performance works were an attempt to control fate, or creating the illusion that you can control fate. In the 70s, he is most prolific for his performances and very such strong, explicit use of his self and his own physical body to risk pain and use like this very engineering drive to use objects to question power and violence and his institutions. And when implicating himself, he uses his body and his physicality in a very explicit and incredibly violent way. Some introductory examples of this include 5 Day Locker Piece, where he literally locked himself in this tiny school locker for 5 days without food or movement. And I think his work is definitely functioning on this like micro scale reenactment of like larger societal logic of obedience, exposure, and self-inflicted punishment. In his work, I think one of the strongest points I want to touch on is that the audience is never merely a spectator, and you know, in these, as you're watching these, you become a witness, and in certain cases, as Stutterheim talks about, an accomplice. Because his actions and his performances don't end just with his physical gestures. They unfold in this constant ethical ambiguity of provoking what are you as the person viewing this willing to tolerate, and how far can you go as a person seeing this just by watching and doing nothing. In his most seminal piece, arguably in Shoot, in 1971, Burden is shot at close range by a friend using a caliber rifle. And it's shot in this bare white room in Santa Ana, California. And there's actually a film shooting of this that I'm going to display, but there is just the friend that has agreed to shoot at Burden, and a handful of people who've agreed to watch this. And Burden is standing still at about 15 feet away from the gun, kind of facing sideways. And the original plan was that the bullet was just going to skim his left arm, kind of like this controlled injury. But in the film, as you see, when the trigger is pulled, the bullet doesn't just graze him, it actually passes through his arm. His friend actually shoots him. I think it's really interesting that he initiated this idea of the performance of Shoot out of like this innate curiosity for what it means to be shot at and a desire to experience the event rather than simply portray it. And it's definitely like, I think he creates this or makes point of this distinction between reality and fiction of what is acceptable in theory versus what is acceptable in the real world. And again, going back to this, as the audience, like merely as a spectator, if you are watching this, you are automatically implicated in this kind of consequential, harmful voyeurism against your own voluntary doing, just by watching this and letting it happen. Another really interesting book I read is this one I read by Pavlinsky, Subject-Object Theory. And he's also a Russian performance artist and very prolific for his incredibly explicit, violent implication of his self in his performance work. He insists that it isn't just when these works are happening, it's not just symbolism or just like a mere form of protest. It's actually this idea of a turnaround where the politics in itself become the medium. And you as the audience, when you enter as subjects, before you go in to see this, you exit as the object, because just merely absorbing, by being an observing participant of the spectacle, your reactions are what proves the system's absurdity. Now I'm kind of going to pivot into a topic that's a little bit more pressing today, this idea of speculative bubbles. And I mean, obviously maybe I've just been kind of blindly influenced in following the mental trajectory parallel of what I've been reading in the news and what is so pressing right now. But I really think what was so striking to me when I was reading Burden and Pavlinsky's work was this idea that it was so dependent on the psychological reaction of the other, like of the audience. And for very brief context, if you don't know what this is, a speculative bubble, this term first coined by Minsky, is basically when asset prices rocket way past something of its real worth, because it's kind of fueled by this cultural hype and expectation of never-ending continuing financial gain. until the first stages of low profit return or oversupply of this subject emerge and the bubble pops, which causes people to mass panic and herd mentality, like draw out their investment all at once and then eventually cause the market to crash. And this is obviously something that kind of devastates it because, up until this point, the entire market and economy and its well-being was kind of functioning around this singular principle of this, like, glorified object that everyone was so excited about, like this new flashy technological beacon of optimism. And as of right now, as you can definitely see, AI is the center of this bubble. And as of December 2025, Nvidia has hit literally 5 trillion. Alphabet stands at 3.8 trillion after doubling, and they've literally, like, all these companies have poured trillions of dollars in financing these data centers, despite the fact that OpenAI and Anthropic revenues still remain honestly very negligible to their valuations. But yeah, like right now, just speak broadly, there's so much that you can say about this right now. But a quote Chris Burden said about his work once was, quote, "When I use pain or fear in a work, it seems to energize the situation." And I think right now at this point, as this bubble has expanded so far, people are starting to get a little bit concerned about this being a bubble. These introductory fears of it being incredibly volatile is kind of creating this also strange simultaneous phenomenon of where people are turning to gold and crypto as like these safe hedges. The price of gold literally rocketed 50% this year to literally a record amount of priced at $4,000 an ounce at one point. It seems like these investors are kind of beginning to flee AI for a little bit more of like safer options and assets amid these fears that the AI bubble might pop and they might lose everything, as has happened historically. But this, I don't know, as I'm reading the news and what I'm reading in literature just kind of always like combines these weird interpoints. But this also reminded me another piece of Burden's that he did, where essentially in 1981 he got this budget from Saint Pompidou in Paris and the Icon Gallery in Birmingham, England. But what he did, his performance was basically consisting of him melting and molding this ounce of gold into this very small, like, Napoleon figurine. It definitely could have passed as like a very like tacky, like cheap souvenir that you could have bought anywhere. And with the diamond in England, what he did is he actually just put the real diamond in his pocket and held a fake similar looking one. And what he's doing with the figurine and the diamond is he's like asking, just with the virtue of his own implication of presentation, does it create more value of what the actual subject that the people viewing like can see and understand? Like, does something become more valuable just by the virtue of you being told that it is more valuable? It's probably a question we should be thinking about right now. And Burden's work, I think, is really questioning how far can you push a culture treats like violence and like such a violent, tumultuous nature of things into everyday imagery and, turn that back around into the form of a real life spectacle, and what it means for you to be in that room full of people with these other people in the spectacle and, take the risk of watching this spectacle. I thought it was relevant to bring up. But I did finish reading this Speculative Communities by Athanasu. And he says a lot of things in this book, but I think the main thing I want to focus on is his point and focus about seeing speculation as like this historical trajectory and how it's evolved from historically like elite gambling to become like this core social force in binding modern society. He talks about this pattern of, having uncertainty during these historical periods of instability. Actually creates this idea of this collective fantasy by sharing like wagers or like making bets on the future. And I think it's really interesting because he notes on this idea that speculative bubbles aren't just like this reflection of human error, but actually it is like a direct reaction and representation of how neoliberals' tendency to have like this very rational, like linear form of politics actually gives more room and like triggers left and right movements to thrive on like this chaos insurance, like via like hopes and optimisms of extreme nationalism, as we see, or like these promises of like utopia through radical like anarchist disruption. And from the city in the 1870s is actually when the first like bucket shops emerged and created this idea of speculating on future land and rent prices. And he talks about how in this context, when the Civil War came, it brought like such great uncertainty and fear about the markets. People started gambling and betting on prices of basic necessities, like even crop prices and food, and hence made agricultural prices so insecure and stable that farmers and people who worked in agriculture kind of faced the brute end of this horrible like consequence of speculating on everything. But on this trajectory of land and how speculation and like the financialization of the market has kind of posited historically against farmers and agricultural workers, I wanted to talk about this very specific chapter in one of my favorite books, Joan Key's Models of Integrity, Art and Law in Post-60s America. And I think I've mentioned this book before in a previous video, I forget which one. And I don't have the physical copy to show you because it's actually on loan to a dear friend of mine. But I did really want to bring up this specific art installation piece that she talks about in this chapter, about this idea of how the legalities of literal territory do influence artwork. And that is Christo and Jeanne Claude's Running Fence, which was a piece that lasted from 1972 to 1976. So Christo and Jeanne Claude met in 1958 in Paris, and the rest of their lives were essentially spent collaborating together as a singular artistic like entity. And they're really known and prolific for creating like these, I'm sure you've seen them, these monumental or environmental installations that enveloped buildings, bridges, and landscapes in like these vast like fabric wrappings, like just wrapping the entire thing. But they really, what they emphasize is this idea of process and confronting like property rights and public space and what it means to be an artist who enters and works within public space. So the specific piece I'm talking about, Running Fence, was actually a 24.5-mile white nylon fence that stretched across Sonoma and Marin ranchlands in Northern California. And in the summer of 1973, the artist actually decided on this specific route in Northern California because part of the reason, as Christo said, was that he had like this long-standing fascination with the idea of the West, and specifically California, in which he kind of described it as, quote, the most American state in their way of living. And I think he meant this in the aspect of land, of like to be American, you know, like the principal foundations of it historically, as you read in history, is all about land. It's about owning land. And it's interesting because, you know, negotiating this passage and setting this piece of work up meant that they had to go through so many numerous private properties in public spaces that demanded so much negotiation, especially being the fact that most of these landowners were farmers. There were a lot of fears and speculation around these farmers who thought that this piece, Running Fence, was kind of just this random, elaborate, like, profit-making scheme, that they thought it was like a scheme to like raise land value for like corporate developers to come later on and take it from them. But what their initial reluctance to this, what made it actually give way to enthusiasm and like agreeing with this, is the fact that the couple kind of changed their negotiation strategy by beginning to speak and advertise like the project's materials. Because what it would take to make this huge, vast, spanning running fence would be 2,050 Army surplus steel poles, 240,000 square yards of nylon fabric, 90 miles of cable, 350,000 hooks that would be returned and given to the farmers after the deinstallation of the piece. So after like this being mentioned to the farmers, they kind of like began to like relent because they kind of envisioned repurposing these fences for their own like operations as farmers, and kind of this like mass connection of like understanding that yes, this actually might benefit me in the future. Like, there is a post-valuation to this, like, this understanding amongst the farmers together to relent and accept this piece legally and vouch for it in, like, legal conferences is what Athanasu, would consider and a speculative imagined community. I thought it was also really interesting to bring up that their actual close friend and art critic theorist friend Alfred Frankenstein actually looked down a lot upon Jeanne and Claude's methods, not because it was illegal, but because to Alfred, it totally betrayed, like, what it means to have conceptual integrity of your work as an artist. And he saw it as reifying this, like, very, I guess, like, individual capitalist view of property, like, kind of subsuming to it by negotiating with these farmers and by kind of like needing to add this aspect of like financialization into it by providing them with some form or sense of like financial post valuation that would keep them in adherence to this and vouch for it. But the key takeaway is that as, the work gained support from local audiences and the local appeal kind of started to slowly draw in to form this mass. This initial support from the local is what caused governments and courts to take this work much more seriously as kind of what Joanne Key defines as the socially necessary experience. Key really interestingly argues that the populist appeal is what eventually morphed into what is called she calls the experienced events, where the initiative is legitimized not by what it looks like, its popularity, or even like the economic benefit, but rather this idea of it being like this historically singular event. Actually understanding that this is a conceptual art piece and it's just like, it's so singular and unique in it and that it must be experienced. And Athanasu actually says, interestingly, historically American farmers, like the social class of farmers, have been so targeted and vulnerable and susceptible to feeding into like early American populist beliefs and this form of like paranoid politics because usually, in these rural backgrounds, they had a very foggy and partial understanding of how the political or, like, the financialized market actually worked. So they were just living with this fear of being demolished and having their entire identity and stability created by crops and agriculture and their entire industry demolished by a higher institutional power, which obviously kind of makes you vulnerable to the irrational and, retreat into this confusion and willing to do anything to ensure that you yourself and your land is safe. And, again, what Jeanne and Claude said about why they chose California for this project is because it was so American to them in the sense that there was so much land. What it means to be American, there is this common thread of this nationalist American drive to see open land and stake for it. And a lot of this historically really clearly seems to have this pattern of this taking upheaval and taking advantage of farmers and ranchers in the process of it. And I think a very critical topic right now that is really important is the fact that it is really difficult for American farmers right now. Despite the majority of his agenda literally being built upon claiming to serve and support especially the blue-collar working class, especially farmers, it seems everything Trump has done up until now has been absolutely totally antithetical to serving them at all. For instance, Chapter 12 farm bankruptcies have literally surged 20% in the first half of 2025 compared to all of 2024. And this is, very evidently drawn in by the tariffs, like spiking the cost of fertilizer and making the input cost of production for farmers so expensive that they're barely making anything in return. And Trump kind of put in this solution to address this, the Family Farmer Relief Act. And basically what it did is it raised the debt cap for farmers to qualify for Chapter 12 bankruptcy. And what Chapter 12 bankruptcy, what it means is that it's a very special U.S. law created in 1986 just for family farmers and fishermen. When you declare Chapter 12, it's not liquidating, like you don't have to sell everything, but rather it's kind of just more so it gives a chance for the farm to reorganize if it's struggling, and it essentially proposes a 3 to 5 year plan to repay part of the debts while still being able to keep your land and your equipment and your business running as a farmer. Also to note, a really important and great channel speaking on this topic right now that I can't recommend more than enough is Farm to Tabor. Her name is Sarah Tabor, and she's someone who speaks on very incredibly personal anecdotes and well-versed knowledge on this and how current policy and culture is impacting small rural American agriculture in real time. So he raised the eligibility from needing to be $4.1 million in debt to over $11 million in debt, which seems, in prospect, like, kind of good, because it's like, oh, more farmers are in debt, so let's make it so that if you are in more debt, they can get more help. Like, it's easier for them to get more help. But actually, Sarah, in her videos, clarifies that these family farms that are benefiting from this increase in debt cap are actually mostly the large agricultural corporate companies and very disgustingly asset rich, while in reality the true small farmers actually, they totally lack the actual borrowing power and resources to even be in that much debt in the first place. Like a small farm, there is no reality in which a small farm will ever be $11 million in debt. It lets these huge, large agricultural corporations and holdings stay in business despite being in debt, and kind of furthering their hold and their grip and their advantages against smaller farmers, positing the small farms to go even deeper and suffer more during this crisis. All of this craziness combined with this new wave of the relentlessness of tech companies to seek like open land, this usually being farmland, to colonize for their data centers that they so need to constantly be building. I mean, it's already crazy that there's already this thing called Virginia's Data Center Alley, which already has 199 facilities and represents 25% of like the global data center capacity. And it's really even more disheartening to see that they are very clearly exploiting the lack of education that is served in these rural communities and towns, because they're kind of like taking advantage of the fact that these people, they have like a little bit more of a lacking understanding of what having a data center in their town truly implies, like the environmental and social and economic consequences of this, and are often really undersold on this by these tech companies, promising like, if you let us put this shiny new data center in the middle of your farmland, guess what, there will be a lot more jobs for you. It's gonna help your economy. This data center is really gonna help you guys. But what happens is instead is that the data center just fucking drains all your groundwater and pollutes your agricultural land, and also doesn't even give you that many jobs. Like, the whole fact of the data center is that it's like pretty like self-operating, except for the fact that it just needs like a crew of maintenance. Like, that's not offering anyone anything or any form of economic prosperity. So after all this, after all these, see, another hard thing about these videos that's like making it a lot more difficult for me to make is they're getting more and more sporadically far apart in terms of subject matter, but they connect in my head. It all goes back to something very simple but large, and in itself I think it's huge how I think we need to change how we understand the self and the other. Because what makes you really think when you watch, like, whether it be like this very explicit reactionary performance art piece or this new story about speculation and how the AI bubble is going to fucking impact everyone and everything once it pops, it is very strongly felt that you are not just a neutral observer. There is no choice in your own lifestyle and the way that you conduct it that will not be implicated without larger consequence in the scheme of things. And obviously it's really difficult not to think about the implications and like larger external consequences of like very small actions that serve you so well in the temporary now. Like, I don't know, I'm thinking about like AI usage, and this is obviously something some people talk about all the time, like I'm not saying anything new here, but I think when we're living this age, especially as young people, like the adrenaline of the satisfaction of everything being convenient The satisfaction of convenience is so addicting by the devices and the algorithms and the methods that allow us to supply this level of convenience without really thinking about the implication of it. And I don't mean to say this to like posit or elicit some like pointed finger of guilted shame at you, but I think it's really important to bring up and think and talk about in this age of convenience what it means to embrace and accept responsibility that inevitably burdens you with more time. But to finish off, I think, I hope we are more understanding and more aware of ourselves. Like I say at the end of every video, thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something from this. I hope you took something away from it. I hope you were able to make coherence of the very, vastly spread apart subjects that I wanted to bring together, and it made sense to you somehow, and you made it to the end of this video. So, thank you for watching, and as this break comes up for me, I hope to be reading a lot more, and I hope to see you in my next art history lecture.